Let me start with something uncomfortable. If fungicide at VT in corn or R3 in soybeans is always profitable, why do multi-year university trials show zero yield response in so many seasons? Nobody likes that question, because for the last 15 years, spraying fungicide, just in case, stopped being a decision. It became a ritual. The plane flies, the high-clearance sprayer rolls, the invoice gets paid, and the justification is always the same: it's cheap insurance. Insurance against what? In tight-margin agriculture, the phrase, cheap insurance, should trigger one thing in your brain: break-even math. Let's do it. If fungicide and application cost you $30 to $40 per acre, and corn is selling for $4.50 per bushel, you need roughly 7 to 9 extra bushels just to break even. Not to profit, to break even. Now ask yourself honestly, how many years in the last decade actually delivered a consistent 8-bushel response on your farm from a prophylactic spray applied without confirmed disease pressure? Not marketing plots, not extreme outbreak years. Your farm, your data, your weather. This is where things get quiet. Because in many seasons, especially low-pressure years, replicated trials show responses in the 0 to 2 bushel range. Sometimes 0 bushels, which means that $35 per acre wasn't insurance. It was margin erosion. And here's the part that matters most in 2026. Margins are no longer padded by high commodity prices. Every input must defend itself. The problem is not fungicide. Fungicide is a tool. The problem is automatic behavior. There was a time when prices were high enough that an extra pass didn't feel painful. When corn was $6 or $7, even a 2-bushel bump felt acceptable. But markets change, habits didn't, and habits, when unexamined, become expensive traditions. If you farm 2,000 acres and spray $35 per acre automatically every year, that's $70,000 annually. Over 10 years? $700,000. That's not cheap insurance. That's a $500,000 decision you may not have evaluated properly. Now let's be clear about something. There are years when fungicide absolutely pays. Severe disease pressure, high humidity, extended leaf wetness, favorable temperatures. In those years, protecting upper canopy leaves preserves photosynthesis and yield. In those years, fungicide isn't insurance. It's protection of real risk. But those years are not every year. And that distinction is the entire point of this series. Because farming today isn't about spraying more. It's about allocating capital with precision. And the question we're going to explore in this episode is simple. Are you making fungicide decisions based on probability? Or based on fear of being the only one who didn't spray? There is social pressure in agriculture that no one talks about. When the neighbor sprays, you feel exposed if you don't. When the retailer recommends it, declining feels risky. When the co-op runs a promotion, it feels logical. But profitability does not care about peer pressure. It cares about numbers. Over the next 4 sections, we're going to break down the myth of yield insurance. What real disease thresholds look like. How to calculate your break-even properly. Why scouting beats scheduled spraying in most low-pressure years. And how discipline separates operators from survivors. If fungicide truly delivers consistent ROI on your acres, the math will prove it. If it doesn't, the math will expose it. And margin discipline always sides with math. This is not anti-chemistry. This is pro-profit. Because in modern agriculture, the most dangerous habit isn't disease. It's spending money automatically. There's a phrase that sounds intelligent, responsible, and financially prudent. Even if disease doesn't show up, fungicide still gives a plant health boost. That sentence has emptied more margins than drought. Because it feels safe. It feels modern. It feels proactive. But let's separate physiology from profitability. Those are not the same thing. Yes, certain fungicides can create minor physiological effects in plants. Slightly delayed senescence, a temporary greening effect, sometimes a small bump in stress tolerance. But here's the economic question. Is that effect large enough, consistent enough, and repeatable enough to justify $30 to $40 per acre in a low disease year? Because if it isn't, then plant health becomes a very expensive aesthetic improvement. Green doesn't automatically mean profitable. Let's bring numbers back into the conversation. If soybeans are $11 per bushel and your fungicide program costs $32 per acre, you need roughly 3 extra bushels just to break even. Now think about how yield actually builds. Yield is determined by genetics, stand establishment, nutrient availability, moisture during reproductive stages, solar radiation, stress timing, Fungicide does not increase genetic ceiling. It protects yield that would otherwise be lost to disease. That's its job. If disease pressure is minimal, what exactly are you protecting? This is where the insurance analogy breaks down. Real insurance protects against catastrophic, unpredictable events. Disease pressure in corn and soybeans is not completely random. It follows environmental conditions, extended humidity, leaf wetness duration, temperature patterns, crop history. These are measurable variables, so the real question becomes, are you evaluating those variables before spraying? Or are you assuming the worst every single year? Let's talk about psychology for a moment. There's a powerful bias in farming called regret avoidance. No one wants to be the grower who skipped fungicide in the 1-year disease exploded. That memory would stick, but here's the flip side that rarely gets equal emotional weight. The 7 years you sprayed and gained nothing. Those losses feel smaller because they're quiet. There's no dramatic failure, just slow margin erosion, and erosion is harder to feel than disaster. But erosion is what weakens long-term viability. When you look at multi-year datasets, a pattern emerges. High disease years show strong response. Moderate years show variable response. Low-pressure years often show negligible response. The distribution is not uniform, which means blanket application is statistically inefficient. Let's frame this differently. Imagine a tool that pays off 3 out of 10 years, breaks even 2 out of 10, and loses money 5 out of 10. Would you automatically invest in that tool every single year without evaluating conditions? Or would you try to identify when those profitable years are likely to occur? That is the core shift from habit-based farming to probability-based farming. And here's something even more uncomfortable. Retail narratives often highlight response years. Marketing materials showcase the 10-bushel wins. They don't lead with the 0 response seasons. Because 0 doesn't sell, but 0 matters, especially when input costs are high and grain prices are moderate. If you're operating 3,000 acres and your average annual fungicide spend is $90,000, then over a decade you've committed close to $1 million. That deserves scrutiny. This isn't about being conservative. It's about being strategic. There is a major difference. Strategic growers don't ask, does fungicide work? They ask, under what specific conditions does fungicide pay? And those conditions are not mystical. They are observable, which leads us into the next critical piece, disease thresholds. Because if you don't know what level of infection justifies action, you are not managing risk. You are reacting to anxiety. And anxiety is not a margin strategy. In part 3, we're going to break down what real disease pressure looks like, what economic thresholds mean, and how to stop treating every season like an outbreak year. Because spraying out of fear might feel responsible, but responsible farming in 2026 is about measured aggression, not automatic reaction. Let's move from theory to field reality. Because everything we've said so far comes down to one thing. At what point does disease risk justify a $30 to $40 decision? Not emotionally, economically. Every disease has 3 ingredients: susceptible host, favorable environment, pathogen presence. Take 1 away, and the threat weakens. Take 2 away, and the threat collapses. But automatic spraying assumes all 3 are always present at damaging levels. That assumption is expensive. Let's talk about real-world examples. In corn, growers fear late-season diseases like tar spot and gray leaf spot. Both can reduce yield significantly under sustained favorable conditions. But those conditions are specific: extended leaf wetness, high humidity, moderate temperatures, dense canopy, continuous corn history. If June and early July are dry, with limited overnight leaf wetness, disease progression slows dramatically. Yet many fields still receive a VT application on schedule. Why? Because calendar spraying ignores probability. Now consider soybeans and white mold. White mold thrives in cool, moist environments with dense canopy and flowering stage overlap with prolonged humidity. But in hot, dry July conditions, its impact is often limited. If the weather pattern does not support disease development, what exactly are you protecting against? This is where economic threshold thinking separates disciplined operators from automatic spenders. An economic threshold is not about whether disease exists. It's about whether disease presence is likely to reduce yield enough to exceed control cost. That's a very different standard. Finding a lesion is not the same as confirming economic loss potential. Seeing a few infected leaves in the lower canopy does not automatically mean upper canopy yield will be compromised. And yet, in many cases, the decision to spray is triggered by visibility, not severity. There is a big difference. Now let's talk numbers again. Assume corn at $4.75. Fungicide plus application at $34. Break even. Just over 7 bushels. To justify that cost, disease pressure must be strong enough to threaten more than 7 bushels of loss. That requires sustained infection, upper canopy involvement, photosynthetic disruption during grain fill, not just scattered lower leaf lesions. Here's the uncomfortable truth. In many low-pressure seasons, disease never climbs into the yield-driving canopy in a meaningful way. But the sprayer already ran, because the calendar said so. And here's another layer few talk about. When every acre gets sprayed regardless of need, you eliminate the opportunity to learn. If you never leave check strips, if you never compare treated versus untreated in low-pressure years, if you never track response field by field, then you're not making data-driven decisions. You're operating on assumption, and assumption is not strategy. Let's zoom out. Agriculture has become extremely good at precision planting, precision fertility, precision guidance. But fungicide often remains blunt force management. Uniform rate, uniform timing, uniform coverage. Even though disease pressure is not uniform, some fields are high risk every year. River bottoms, continuous corn, heavy residue, poor airflow. Those fields might justify consistent protection. Others do not, but blanket application treats them all the same. And uniform decisions across variable risk landscapes are rarely optimal. Now let's address the emotional elephant in the room. What if this is the year disease explodes and I didn't spray? That fear is valid, but here's the reality. If scouting, weather models, and historical data indicate rising risk, application can still occur. Modern equipment moves fast. A decision delayed is not necessarily a decision denied. There's a difference between being prepared and being preemptive without cause. Preparation means watching risk indicators closely. Preemptive spraying without signals is speculation. Speculation has its place in markets. It is less appropriate in input spending. Because here's the bottom line. You are not paid for preventing imaginary loss. You are paid for maximizing net return. In Part 4, we'll build a practical framework for calculating your own break-even, factoring probability into the equation, and turning fungicide from habit into conditional strategy. Because once you quantify risk instead of fearing it, the decision gets clearer. And clarity is where margin lives. Up to this point, we've dismantled the habit. Now we replace it with a system. Because eliminating automatic spraying without replacing it with a disciplined framework just creates hesitation. And hesitation is not strategy either. So here's how grown-up margin management works. Step 1. Calculate true cost. Not just product price. Total applied cost. Product, application, fuel, labor, depreciation, opportunity cost of that pass. If your invoice says $28 but the real field level cost is $35, use $35. Margin math demands honesty. Step 2. Calculate break-even yield response. If corn is $4.80 and cost is $36, you need 7.5 bushels to break even. If soybeans are $10.50 and cost is $32, you need just over 3 bushels. Write that number down every year. That is your trigger line. Not your feelings, not last year's memory, that number. Step 3. Assign probability. This is where most growers stop thinking. They treat fungicide as binary, spray or don't spray. But probability changes everything. Ask yourself, given current weather patterns, given crop stage, given hybrid or variety susceptibility, given field history, given current scouting data, what is the realistic probability of losing more than 7 bushels? Not theoretical worst case, realistic probability. If that probability is low, spraying is financially irrational. If that probability is moderate to high, spraying becomes logical. This is how professional risk managers think. They don't eliminate risk, they price it. Now let's make it practical. You can divide your acres into 3 categories: high risk acres, moderate risk acres, low risk acres. High risk: continuous corn, history of severe foliar disease, dense canopy, high humidity region, susceptible genetics. These acres may justify routine protection more often. Moderate risk: rotated fields, variable weather, occasional disease history. These require close monitoring and conditional decisions. Low risk: dry climates, strong airflow, limited disease history, resistant hybrids. These acres likely lose money under automatic spraying in most years. Yet how often are all 3 categories treated identically? That uniformity is convenience. Convenience costs money. Now here's another layer that sharpens the blade. Use check strips every year. Leave untreated passes. Measure response, not once, repeatedly, over multiple seasons, because your farm's data matters more than anyone else's. University trials are valuable, but your soil, your weather, your management intensity create unique response curves. If after 5 years of disciplined comparison you see consistent 6 to 8 bushel gains, you have evidence. If you see 0 to 2 bushels most seasons, you also have evidence. Data replaces debate. Now let's address timing. One of the biggest financial improvements comes not from eliminating fungicide entirely, but from delaying commitment until risk signals increase. Many outbreaks show warning signs. Weather shifts, humidity spikes, disease detected regionally, crop stage aligns with vulnerability. The window between signal and economic damage is often sufficient to act. Modern equipment covers acres quickly. The idea that you must spray blindly to avoid missing the window is increasingly outdated. Preparedness beats pre-scheduled reaction. Now let's confront the quiet pressure from input channels. Retailers are not villains. They operate on sales volume. You operate on net return. Those incentives are not always perfectly aligned, which means final responsibility sits with you, because nobody protects your margin like you do. In Part 5, we zoom out. We look at long-term consequences of automatic input decisions, resistance risk, and how disciplined capital allocation defines the next generation of profitable operators. Because this conversation is bigger than fungicide. It's about identity. Are you running acres, or are you running a business? Let's zoom out. This was never just about fungicide. It's about how decisions get made on your farm. There was a time when agriculture rewarded expansion first and efficiency second. More acres, more yield, more bushels. But today, capital discipline is the edge. Margins are thinner. Volatility is higher. Input costs are sticky. Commodity prices are unpredictable. Which means one thing. Automatic spending is no longer harmless. It's structural weakness. When fungicide is applied every year without regard to risk signals, 3 things happen quietly. Margins erode in low-pressure seasons. Resistance pressure increases over time. Decision-making becomes less analytical and more habitual. Let's talk about resistance for a moment. Every time a fungicide is applied unnecessarily, you increase selective pressure on pathogen populations. Over time, reduced sensitivity becomes a possibility. When that happens, control becomes harder. And harder control means higher rates, more expensive chemistry, fewer effective options. In other words, tomorrow's cost increases because of today's convenience. That's not a scare tactic. That's evolutionary biology. Now let's talk about identity. There are 2 kinds of operators emerging in modern agriculture. The first type says, "We've always done it this way." The second type says, "Show me the numbers this year." The first type relies on tradition. The second relies on conditional strategy. Tradition built American agriculture, but conditional strategy sustains it in volatile markets. Here's the uncomfortable but empowering truth. You do not get paid for activity. You get paid for net return. A sprayer moving across a field looks productive, but productivity and profitability are not synonyms. A field that does not need fungicide and does not receive fungicide, that is disciplined profit preservation. That doesn't look dramatic, but it compounds. Let's go back to our earlier math. 2,500 acres. $34 per acre. $85,000 annually. If even half of those acres do not justify treatment in low-pressure years, that's potentially $40,000 preserved. In 5 years, $200,000. In 10 years, that's real capital. That's machinery upgrades, debt reduction, land equity, operating flexibility. And here's the part that matters most to seasoned growers. You've survived long enough to know that cycles always turn. Good years, tight years, expansion years, correction years. The farms that survive cycles are not the most aggressive. They are the most disciplined. This doesn't mean stop spraying fungicide. It means earn the right to spray. Every acre, every season, every decision. If scouting confirms rising pressure, if weather aligns with disease development, if economics justify the move, then spray with confidence. That is decisive management. But if pressure is low, if canopy is clean, if weather is unfavorable for disease, then withholding is not risky. It is strategic restraint. Restraint is not weakness. It is financial maturity. Because in modern agriculture, the most dangerous phrase is not disease outbreak. It's we always do it. Automatic nitrogen rates, automatic seed populations, automatic fungicide passes. Each one might look small, Together, they define whether your operation builds capital or leaks it. This channel exists for one reason: to question comfortable habits that cost money. Not because inputs are bad, not because chemistry doesn't work, but because margin is king. And margin demands proof. So here's the final filter you can apply to any input decision moving forward. If I had to justify this expense to a lender with hard numbers, could I? If the answer is yes, proceed. If the answer is probably, or everyone else is doing it, pause. Because disciplined operators do not spray out of fear. They spray out of calculated necessity. And in the next decade of American agriculture, that difference will separate operators from survivors. Precision is profit, habit is expense, and every acre is a financial decision whether you treat it like one or not. If this helped you look at your acres differently, that's the goal. This channel isn't about chasing trends. It's about protecting margin. If you believe every dollar on the farm should justify itself, subscribe. Because we're not here to spray more. We're here to farm smarter. And in this market, smarter wins.